Hey, gang, we are here in remote today going to cover standards 4.9 and 4.10. So, what we're going to do in 4.9, we're going to start with that, is quickly review what supranationalism is. Remember, you previously defined this. This is where you have several countries come together to form a really large organization where they want to achieve goals and maybe even have benefits for all of the members that have joined that organization. Now, what we're going to discuss through this standards is some of the challenges that they have to basically give up some sovereignty to be part of those supranational organizations. And we're going to kind of apply this to ESPN. So quickly, remember what supranationalism groups are, organizations. Some of those are listed here on the slide, like the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, OPEC, World Bank. All of those are examples of supranational organizations. Okay, so let's start with economic supranationalism. All you need to know here for your definition or description is when countries come together to cooperate economically. Okay, so that's what you're going to put in that column for definition description. Now, some examples of this, of what they might achieve would be lowering tariffs. Okay, so tariffs are just basically taxes, so they would all benefit from that. A second example that you can put there would be they would be able to trade more freely among each other. And then the third example is they might even specialize in certain sectors in business. Okay, and some examples there I put, let me move my square, would even be manufacturing, technology, or natural resources. Okay, so those are examples of why countries would come together for economic reasons to join an organization. Okay, all right, let's look at political reasons, and this is going to be more specifically military and strategic supranationalism. So all you need to know for definition description is this is where countries come together to cooperate more militarily. Okay. Examples of that is where you have really strong alliances, then you're less likely to get attacked by another country if you know that you have other countries basically on your side. Okay. The other thing is giving up sovereignty is you will have to defend that country. If you're not being attacked, but somebody in the alliance is, then you're going to have to step up with your military. And so that's an example of loss of sovereignty. All right, another example is these countries that would come together militarily would be able to share not only their warfare technology, but they would also be able to share training and even military bases. Okay, so that's a pretty big benefit. All right, next is going to be environmental supranationalism. And just like it sounds, this is where countries are going to come together and cooperate on environmental issues. Okay, so some examples of that is they might set limits for air and water pollution. Okay, another example is they might come together to protect specific animal species. And then a third is they might even try to manage some of those local environmental issues, especially if they are really complicated by political borders. Okay, so that's environmental supranationalism. Now, this last piece here is what we're going to talk about is effects of supranationalism. This is where you kind of have a country that if it joins this organization, depending on which one it is, they might have to cede some of their sovereignty to that organization. So let me give you some examples. So obviously for description, just explain there in that box that some countries might lose part of their sovereignty. And then some examples of this is like for the European Union, in order to be part of the European Union, right, these countries in Europe formed the European Union, is they had to give up their currency. Okay, so like Germany, France, they all had to give up their currency and operate under what's called the euro, which you probably already heard of that. Okay, so that's one good example. And another one is in NATO. If you are a part of that alliance, then you might have to defend a country that is attacked in NATO. Okay, you have to step up and put your military out there. All right, and the last example is the Keto Protocol. This actually operates under the United Nations and is specifically addressed climate change. And if you're a country that is in that protocol or in that organization, you have to agree to limit your gas emissions in your country. Okay. So that concludes 4.9, and we're going to move on to 4.10 and be done.
Okay, 4.10, here we go. So the good news is this is a little bit of review. We're just going to dive deeper into it. So do you remember when we did centrifugal and centripetal forces last unit? So we'll quickly review what those are, but what we're going to do from here in the standard is what do those forces actually lead to? Okay, so this is a quick little play on letters that might help you remember. I don't know, like if you get them mixed up, centrifugal means pulling apart. Falls apart. So the F stands for falls. And then centripetal, the P could stand for pulls together. I don't know if that might help if you get them mixed up. So F falls apart, P pulls together. So let's quickly just review what each of these means and give some examples. So centrifugal is obviously forces that pull countries apart, and some examples of that are where you have a lot of different ethnic groups or nationalities in a country or state, where you have economic inequality, where you have territorial disputes, or even lack of infrastructure. So any of those will work as examples. And now we're going to dig into what happens when you have these forces, what that can lead to. Okay, and that's where we're going to talk about the failed states and even development and so forth. Okay, so let's start with failed states here. So just you want to define this. A failed state is where you have a state basically that's unable to perform basic governmental responsibility. It is failed to have control over its land, and maybe even failing to provide basic services and necessities to the people. And honestly, that is exactly what is happening in these example countries listed. So we haven't talked about Sudan yet, or South Sudan, sorry, but South Sudan is the newest country added to a world map. I think it's just been in the past 5 years. And so South Sudan did get sovereignty from Sudan, but since then it has been an absolute disaster, and they are a failed state. So they're at war, they're unable to provide water, food for their people, and it's just a hot mess. Yemen and Syria are in very similar situations. I believe we talked about Syria in our migration unit, and they are in a civil war, and many Syrians fleeing into Greece and Europe. I think we watched well, no, we didn't watch anything, but I think we did talk about it during our migration unit. I'm sorry. So that's failed states. Let's look at uneven development. So for your definition, it's just economic development that is it's not consistent throughout its state. So throughout the state, or whether it's just a geographic area, it's not going to be equal everywhere. So a great example of this is where you have cities that are really developed and there's strong economy there, but it is not that way in the rural parts of, say, that country. Okay, so that's a great example to use there. And then stateless nations, guys, this is review, so no big surprise here. So again, this is what a centrifugal force would lead to, is where you have people that don't have a nation or that don't have a state at all. So again, stateless nation, a quick definition is where you have a nation of people, remember, that don't have a state, that are actually fighting to establish their own government and land. Okay, they want their own state. Examples of this again is the Kurds or the Palestinians. All right, now, I pretty much forgot to put this in your outline, so I'm hoping you guys will find a place somewhere on your note sheet to add ethnic nationalist movement, because you do need to have some kind of knowledge of this. So I'm really sorry that I didn't provide a space for that. If you can find a place to put ethnic nationalist movements, and then the definition of this is where you have a specific group in a country or a state they want more autonomy. And what that means is they want more government power over themselves, or they might want a full separation from that country, and that is going to be based on maybe ethnicity or their nationality. So great examples that you've heard before is the Catalans and the Basque, who want their ethnic nationalist movement, and they want to separate from Spain. Okay, and then Balkanization again would also be an example of ethnic nationalist movement. So when we talk about former Yugoslavia and what happened there and why it broke apart, that was all a difference of ethnicities. Okay, and if you guys understand what I mean by ethnicity, it's like the nationality of a person, and it can be tied to any cultural aspect. It can be tied to language, religion, and so forth. All right, so that is our that concludes the centrifugal. Let's look at, whoops, I went too far. Let me get back there. Okay, let's talk about centripetal. Okay, now centripetal, you want to write a quick definition of that. Remember, that means where you have forces that bind countries back together. Okay, and some quick examples of centripetal forces could be where you have a really strong national government, and people that live in a country or a state have a shared history, so they have commonality, and they have maybe a common language or religion. They have a good, strong economic development, or they unite against an external threat, which is kind of similar to what happened to this country after 9/11. We had a really, really strong centripetal force of coming together as a nation after 9/11. All right, so on your template there, we're going to dig into what centripetal forces can lead to, okay? And so we'll talk about those. The first thing is ethno-nationalism. So know what that is. That is a national identity based on a common ethnicity, okay? It could also be an attempt to tie in with an ethnicity based on nationalism. Okay, so a great example for this would be India's government is currently trying to make India an ethno-nationalist identity based on Hindu, which is their religion. They want to be recognized as a Hindu nation. Okay, so again, that's ethno-nationalism. The next one is more equitable infrastructure development. And so just make sure you understand what infrastructure is. That's just like basically like a transportation system or services in hospitals and buildings and bridges and all of the things that you would see in a city. And so a more united country that has really strong infrastructure is going to trickle out to the rest of that country. So you're likely to see a more economic development that's spread not just in the cities, but everywhere in that nation or in that country. And then some just quick examples I already mentioned in transportation infrastructure, especially if people live outside of the city and they're commuting, that's really a strong thing to have to bring people into work. And then urban versus rural, which we've already talked about. So when you see that, you have strong infrastructure in your rural areas and not just in your cities. All right. And then I believe this is our last one. So increased cultural cohesion. So this is where you can have a shared culture or a history or even national traditions. But some great examples of that is where you have maybe a really strong transportation system or a really strong economy. And I kind of think this is a great example is where you have a really strong leader that's able to unify a country that has a lot of diversity and people from all different cultures. And sometimes countries experience really strong leaders like that. And again, that is going to be a centripetal force that leads to a cultural cohesion. Okay. All right, guys, that is it. That concludes 4.10. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you next time.